Welcome to Slow News Day Live. My name is Steve Poikinen. I'm here in lockdown Boulder Creek, California, and you guys, I'm just kind of stoked right now. The gentleman I'm going to be interviewing this afternoon is a financial advisor genius as far as I'm concerned. I used to listen to him on KPIG radio here in Santa Cruz County. He would do the midday financial reports. It was always half educational and half hilarious, just full-throated ranting. I'm hoping we get a little bit of both today. Please welcome to the show for the first time, Caleb Lawrence. Caleb, how are you today, sir?
So far, so good, Steve. Making great use of my home office here in the lockdown period and trying to keep the cabin fever at bay.
Yeah. I mean, at least they're still letting us out in our own yards right now. I know. I've heard that a number of different municipalities are starting to require that people go out. If they go out, they have to go out in masks. I've had a couple of different people on the show to kind of bring us up to speed on what's going on with the virus itself. And the excessive loss of liberties that we're all facing as a result of, emergency powers granted. But what I haven't done a real deep dive on yet is what's in the CARES Act and why a couple $1 trillion giveaway to Wall Street and the banks is good for us as regular people. So I guess I'll start by asking you, what the hell is this thing, and what are we ultimately as regular working people going to get out of it?
Well, the CARES Act is a very complex piece of legislation that was recently signed into law, and it does include quite a number of things that should help your average consumer, your small business owner, people with student loans to a degree, and a lot of small businesses. But as you allude, once again, it is another huge handout for corporate America, and it shows once again the efficacy of their lobbying and special action committees in buying off our political representatives for their benefit at our expense.
And I've heard a lot of people refer to this as we keep having the largest transfer of wealth that we've ever had over and over again. And the economic stimulus in 2008, that turned into, I think, a total of either 14.9 or 16.9 trillion that was ultimately allocated to banks and Wall Street. Is the 2.2 trillion number that people are citing right now, is that any kind of accurate, or are we going to see more and more infusions going to these Federal Reserve banks throughout the next even year?
Well, I think the 2.2 trillion is certainly a start. I mean, the Treasury is already asking for additional funds for the small business loans aspect of this. And I also believe that this crisis is going to make the last two, i.e. the great financial crisis of 07-09 and the dot-com crash back in 2000, as I had the misfortune of going through both, it's going to make both of those look like a walk in the park. And despite a lot of prognostications to the contrary, I really don't believe that this is going to be a short-lived event that is going to essentially disappear and we all go back to living happily ever after in the suburbs behind a white picket fence in a pink house anytime soon.
Well, what leads you to that conclusion? Why I have similar thoughts. I'm curious as to yours, because this is the world you live in. This is the world you operate in. Is it, just a history of mismanagement and corruption, or is there anything that raises a forest of red flags for you in the particular legislation?
Well, I think there's certainly a lot of moving parts to this, Steve. I think one of the larger moving parts is the absolutely fragmented and disjointed federal response to this at the national level that has, basically allowed the genie out of the bottle, a genie that we have no way of putting back in. There's a lot of talk about vaccines and things of that nature, but the virus mutates. There are, at last I saw, I think 8 different strains of this, and coming up with a viable vaccine in anything under a year's time is probably wishful thinking at best. And even then, you get into a situation of we have to produce enough vaccine to vaccinate 330 odd million people, which is the population of the US. And when you start looking at the numbers and things of that nature, you realize that it's going to take a long time just to physically administer all those vaccines to people, just like it's going to take a long time to physically administer a test to everybody to verify that they actually have or don't have this disease. So I think that's part of it. From an economic side, you have two components there, which I think they're both going to act together. And one of those is initially you're going to have a supply side shock, where you're going to see the just-in-time, lean, very complicated, very diverse global supply chains get heavily disrupted due to transportation blockades, border closings, quarantine protocols, and things of the like. And that's going to be followed up by a very severe demand shock that is going to be a side effect of the shelter-in-place orders and the other various lockdown protocols that have been instituted essentially globally at this point in time. And so when you put those two together, the economic data is going to get hit very, very hard. And we're already starting to see the inklings of that. We had in the last 2 weeks of March, for example, we had very nearly 10 million initial claims for unemployment. We had 2.38 million, I believe it was, in the third week of March, and 6.6 or 6.8 billion in the fourth week of March. And to put that in perspective, to give you an idea of just how crazy those numbers are, during the height of the great financial crisis, the greatest figure for weekly initial claims only reached 771,000. And during the height of the dot-com crisis, the worst week for initial claims was only about 500,000. So you've got a huge issue there. And what that's going to translate into is a lot of lost economic activity, and I would expect a severe recession this summer. And I also expect the unemployment rate to break double digits. With the infection rates and the deaths themselves, I expect those to continue more or less on an exponential curve through at least the end of April and probably the middle of May. Okay. If that wasn't bad enough, when you start looking at the only other pandemic in history that really compares to this, which was the Spanish flu of 1918, that too was a coronavirus. That virus also mutated just like the present one. It was also very virulent. It's spread through airborne aerosols and various droplets that come out of us as we breathe and cough and sneeze, etc. And that virus actually took about a year to play out. There was an initial wave that wasn't that large, and then there was a bit of a lull in the summer, and then there was a huge wave after that was very large during the winter of 18 and 19. And then there was another smaller wave after that where it kind of petered out as 2019 went into the summer. So those are the things that I really feel are going to kind of drive this forward and also really kind of hit home for your average American.
That's less than rosy, Caleb. I know. And a $1,200 check, a one-time $1,200 check. Which is what was dangled in front of our Congress critters, and they ultimately decided on. I mean, obviously that's not going to cover people for a year's worth of being out of job. That's not going to cover people who are unemployed at the rate of 6% or 9% or 11 or 15 or however high it gets. The thing that I think a lot of people aren't grasping is that the $1,200 itself essentially amounts to an advance on next year's tax returns in terms of a tax credit. Do I have that right? Do I have that wrong? Can you please explain that? Because we're trying to figure it out, right now.
There's a lot of pieces to the CARES Act, and there's a lot of details there, as is usually the case with any legislation. The one-time $1,200 payout, it is means tested. If you make over a certain amount of income, you're not going to get anything. There's forbearance for student loans if they're federal student loans, where they'll let you skip a few payments, although they're not going to be forgiven. There's forbearance for mortgages of up to a year. Again, they have to be federally sponsored, but again, those payments aren't going to be forgiven. They're simply going to be delayed and then tacked on to the end of the mortgage. There's a number of items in there for small business owners, loans to help cover payroll, keep the lights on, and things of that nature. Certain tax credits are available. There's a number of other programs that are designed to help healthcare and local government, the airline industry, and a few others that managed to persuade our Congress critters to throw them a bone with their political action committees and their lobbyists. But I really feel that what is being offered to the individual American on Main Street is, while it's certainly better than nothing, it's really not much in the grand scheme of things. I mean, anybody who's lived in the Central Coast of California for any amount of time knows that $1,200 isn't going to get you far with respect to paying rent and things of that nature. Certainly, there's other part of the country where it'll make a much greater impact. But I really feel it's kind of window dressing that's designed to appease the masses as opposed to really help them.
And I guess my follow up to that would be like when we go, assuming there is a next year and we go to file taxes next year, is that $1,200 deducted for absorbed by whatever tax credit we may have? Because the way that I saw it explained was that 1 month for a minimum wage worker at $7.25 an hour is $1,160. That rounds up to $1,200. And it comes out of next year's the earned income tax credit. And I'm not sure if I have that 100% right, but if you were only going to get $800 in a credit, does that mean you would owe the government $400?
The specific details, Steve, in the Act, it's $1,200 for individuals with an adjusted gross income of AGI up to $75,000, $2,400 for joint filers, i.e. a married couple or cohabitating couple with an AGI of up to $150,000, plus an additional $500 for each child under the age of 17, subject to certain exemptions. This is paid to taxpayers through an advanced refundable tax credit against their 2020 income taxes. There's also a phase out of the rebate, which causes a $50 reduction in the rebate for every $1,000 of adjusted gross income or AGI above these thresholds. For example, individuals with no children having an adjustable gross income of more than $99,000 and married couples with no children filing jointly having an adjusted gross income of more than $198,000 would be phased out completely and receive no recovery rebate. The other item to keep in mind with these things is that it's my understanding that they are going to be distributed based upon an adjusted gross income level, with the lower adjusted gross income brackets having these payments distributed to them first, and the higher adjusted gross income brackets having them distributed later. And so it could be quite a number of months for some individuals that are eligible for this program to actually receive their payment in the form of an electronic deposit, because they have that sort of a relationship with the IRS.
My wife is a bookkeeper and does accounting and whatnot, and she was just on the phone with her sister, and they were talking about whether or not unemployment benefits would be paying out at 100%. Is that something that you can speak to? Are you aware of that? What's going on with that right now?
The retirement or the unemployment benefits are going to be enhanced. The time period is going to be extended. I believe it's to 39 weeks, and an additional $600 is going to be provided per week. And so the benefits are a lot more generous than they normally would be, and they're a lot easier to get and achieve at the complete level.
So is there's a lot of people making a case that this is an indictment of capitalism and that capitalism needs socialism to bail it out every 10 years. What's your take on that? Because I'm personally, like, I advocate just collective ascension of humanity in general and moving to a cashless society. But that's a little bit further down the road from where we're at.
Well, I think the founding fathers and Adam Smith, when they originally put the Constitution together and founded this country back in the day, had the idea that laissez-faire capitalism, or free market capitalism as it is called today, where the feature is little, if any, government intervention or interference, was really the flavor of capitalism that was most desired. Over time, corporations, demonstrated that they were all about making money, because that's really what it's all about. And they were more than happy to engage in all manners of exploitation and environmental destruction and various other unsavory acts in the pursuit of that profit. In the modern era, with the special interest groups and the political action committees and lobbying and everything else, capitalism in America, by definition, doesn't really exist. When you have the corporations climbing in bed with the government to the extent that they have in the US, it's not capitalism anymore. It's fascism by definition, for anybody who cares to look it up. And I know the word fascism really freaks out a lot of people. I was originally born in Europe, and I'm of European descent. And so, that means a lot more to me than I guess a lot of people, primarily because the Nazis literally turned my grandparents' house in London into a bomb crater.
Yeah.
And so there's some family history there. But when, with the bailouts in 2007, 2009, during the great financial crisis, there were a number of takeaways from that. Number one, the task force that looked at the causes of that came back, and one of their primary findings was that the reason the crisis occurred was a failure to enforce existing rules and regulations. The response to that in the post-crisis period back then was to just create the Dodd-Frank Act, create even more rules and regulations, and have even less enforcement that continues to this day. How that makes sense from a common sense perspective, I couldn't tell you, but it is what it is. In addition, you have a situation where the profits remained private, but the losses were socialized. So when the corporations did all manner of reckless, irresponsible, and flat out stupid things, anybody with half a brain that was looking at what was going on would have realized that it was all but guaranteed to end badly, and of course it did. And then when that occurred, the corporations went running to the Treasury, and they went running to Hank Paulson, the Treasury Secretary at the time, and they said, "Oh, please, 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 you've got to bail us out. If you don't bail us out, then the end of the world is going to come, and it's going to be Armageddon and blah, blah, blah." Well, in a truly capitalist society, and in a healthy society in general, I really feel that there has to be a negative price to pay, and that is the consequences of making bad decisions. And if the price isn't paid and extracted, then people don't learn the very important lesson that they need to learn, which is to be more careful about the decisions they make, because the bad decisions could have consequences that come back to bite them in the rear.
Well, and let's be honest, the people that are running the show on Wall Street, the people that run the show within these various, international banking cartels, have led a fairly consequence-free life. And the fact is, when we have a two-tiered criminal justice system that allows very wealthy people to pay a fine or do less time or afford the best attorneys, they're going to see significantly less punishment, and especially punishment that registers in their brain that I shouldn't do this anymore. And you're right, when we gave a whole new set of rules to the banks through Dodd-Frank, they were barely enforceable. It was toothless when it arrived on the table in order to be debated and voted on, and became even more gutted throughout the original legislating process and then after the fact. What can do you, what can we do as, like, I don't know, and when I say we, I'm talking about me and a vast majority of the people that watch this show that are in a paycheck to paycheck situation. Um, what can we do collectively to try and make sure that, or at least put ourselves in a safer position from predatory banks, predatory lenders, things of that nature?
Well, I think the problems for your average American on Main Street trace back about 40 years. One of the things that I used to report on frequently in my 19 years on KPIG was I would talk about how your average American from a real or inflation adjusted basis hasn't had a raise in 40 years based upon the earned income data. And when you really started to look hard at that data and you broke it down into quintiles, you found that the income gains that were accruing, all of it was going to the top quintile, and really the top, you could say the top 10%, but actually it was more likely the top 1%. And the further down the socioeconomic ladder you went, the greater the retreat in income on a real or inflation adjusted basis, where those at the bottom had seen their incomes decline substantially from that perspective. And at the same time, you had the relentless march upward in prices, particularly with respect to housing and healthcare and education. And a lot of the Fed's programs, and particularly the zero interest rate policies, those come with severe negative side effects that are rarely, if ever discussed by the mainstream media. Number one, they crucify savers and those on a fixed income, such as our folks and our parents and things of that nature, as they can no longer get a decent return on their fixed income investments anymore without taking a lot of risk. As you know, you currently got a 10-year treasury that's paying about 0.75%, and you've got a 30-year treasury that pays about 1.3%. You know, long-term treasury rates, you know, back when they started in the financial industry in the early 90s, were closer to 6 and 7%. Okay, so there's that. You have also, too, in addition to encouraging all manner of leverage speculation, particularly with respect to real estate and things of that nature, you get a lot of a dramatic rise in prices for these items. And as the price for the house goes up, so does the rents go up too. And those gains have far outstripped anything seen on the earned income side.
Yeah.
And I really feel that at this point in time, that those policies they're number one, they're going to crucify every single pension plan out there. And you're already starting to see a lot of that with plans, you know, filing bankruptcy and funding levels falling to an average of about 70 cents on the dollar. But I think also one of the more dramatic and really tragic side effects of the zero interest rate policy is the epidemic of homelessness that we now see across the country, as people they literally can't afford to pay the rent, you know, and they're one step away from financial disaster. There have been a number of studies that have shown that the average person doesn't have $500 saved, and if they had any kind of an unforeseen financial expense, like the car broke down or they got a shelter-in-place order and their income went to zero, it's going to get really ugly for these people very, very quickly.
No, and it did. I mean, it happened to me living here in Santa Cruz County about 10 years ago. There were my children were very young. They were in preschool at the time, but we spent 7 months in state parks and in people's living rooms until we could find a place that would rent to us, because A, the rent was ridiculously high, but B, there were so many foreclosed homes that that the banks weren't renting out, bank-owned properties that nobody was renting out. That there was, I think at the time, like 65 families per one application on a rental unit. So I mean, this is something that I've actually lived through and would prefer not to live through it again. A number of the people that come on this show, and I am in 100% agreement with this, have been calling for rent strikes, debt strikes, and a general strike. Because we really don't feel like there's any other way to gain any kind of agency or actual representation. Do you have any thoughts on that? Do you have any thoughts on a nationwide rent strike, debt strike, or general strike?
Well, I think they are inevitable responses to the current circumstances, and the current circumstances in the United States include record wealth and income inequality that has reached levels never before seen, not only in this country but throughout the world. You know, worse than the Roman Empire, worse than Russia just prior to the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, worse than France during one of their many revolutions. And when you create this type of an environment, and I think the Federal Reserve and a lot of our economic policies are directly to blame here, they are resolved through one of four ways, and none of those ways are really that pretty. You know, the least socially wrenching model is that the government realizes that they've got a real problem, and they steadily move to correct the issue through changes in legislation and economic policy at the domestic level. Some other very common ways of resolving these issues is through a large war, some sort of national level revolution, of which strikes and things of that nature are kind of the nascent beginnings of that type of thing. And then finally, you have some sort of famine or disease type event, which we are now also living through with the COVID-19 or coronavirus crisis. And then, but you have to have that kind of catalytic event to sort of put the change in motion. You know, I met with a client many years ago, and real great gal, just funny as all get out. And I was asking her my usual number of questions about, you know, different things about her life and everything else to fill out the account forms as required. And one of the questions I asked her, I says, what's your date of birth? And she came back and she looked at me and she says, Caleb, she says, I've been lying about that for so long, I can't even remember clearly myself anymore. Which I thought was really funny. I'm going to have to remember that one. But one of the other things that she said to me was, she says, you know, I lived through the Vietnam War and all those demonstrations then. And my friends and I were always remarked on how bad things had to get before your average person finally stood up and marched in the streets in large numbers and said, we're not going to put up with this anymore. And this is a conversation I've been having with my friends and associates for quite a number of years now, is I'm amazed at how, I don't know if docile is the right word, but certainly, you know, willing to go along with the status quo the American people are in the face of record-setting income and wealth inequality like we have today.
I did a show last week on an essay that I had read, and I closed it out. I don't have it up. But one of the main premises of the essay is that America is the most propagandized country in the world. And that as a rule, we are not taught our own history, let alone the history of other countries. And so our scope is limited from birth, and it becomes incumbent on each and every individual to go and widen their scope, or if they're lucky enough to be born into a family wealthy enough to afford college, then at that point, once they're 18 years removed from a chance to have this access to this information, then their scope becomes wider, and it will definitely get you some complacent citizens that way, or at least citizens that are hardwired to not rock the boat. And I think one of the greatest tragedies of Occupy is that the end result was nobody knew where to go from there, and nobody knew how to really address the problems that were already existing but continuing to mount. And what happened right after that was the National Defense Authorization Act in 2011 that was put into place in 2012 had a couple of different lines in it, and one was the indefinite detention of U.S. citizens. Another one was the complete legalization of propaganda on U.S. airwaves. And at that moment, you started having the same actors that had caused the financial crisis to come on as hosts and experts throughout mainstream media and tell you why quantitative easing was a good idea, or why we had to bail out this sector and this sector as opposed to giving, you know, regular people some means for mere survival. The anti-war left was put to sleep during the Obama administration, just absolutely almost utterly extinguished. And if it weren't for, you know, Medea Benjamin and Code Pink and a number, you know, a handful of other activist groups, it would have gone away entirely. But I do feel like conditions are right in this moment for us to, like, we're already locked down at home. We can participate in an at-home general strike, and we don't have to worry about getting mowed down in the middle of the streets by cops with tear gas or rubber bullets or water cannons like they used on the Dakota Access Pipeline protesters. I'm sorry, my kid just poked his head in the office here for a minute, threw me off my game. We talked a little bit before we went on about, because I had a question about the Federal Reserve and the Treasury kind of moving with it, and you chuckled and you said, well, the Federal Reserve isn't even federal. So let's kind of break down the history of the Fed and what it does as an institution during these last, 15, 20 minutes or so.
All right, I just like to quickly touch on your whole media thing. Like you, I look at the mainstream national media, and it is, at this point in time, in all fairness, it has more in common with a propaganda directorate than it does an actual news service. And I think that's obvious in their day-to-day broadcast, where it's, they are clearly pushing a narrative, and what fits their narrative sees the light of day, and what doesn't is basically shoved down the rabbit hole, and any kind of protest or anything that goes counter to the official narrative gets shoved down that rabbit hole, never to see the light of day if they can help it. But getting on to the Federal Reserve, the Federal Reserve was created in 1913 on Jekyll Island in North Carolina, I believe it was, and they basically went down there in the middle of the night during if memory serves, a recess of Congress to sign the bills that would make the Federal Reserve into a reality. And the only thing federal about the Federal Reserve is the word federal. It's not even a government agency, pardon me, and it's made up of a who's who of the nation's banksters. And so, they have a vested interest in keeping their little gravy train going. There were attempts earlier in the history of the U.S. to have like a Federal Reserve so they could do fractional reserve lending and everything else. And I believe it was Andrew Jackson that literally nipped that idea in the bud, thankfully, back in the day. And I think he said, what was that famous quote that he said, that if you allow the bankers to take over, they will steal everything from you. And in the end, you will have, and I'm paraphrasing here, you won't have a window, you won't have a pot to piss in or a window to throw it out of. And what we're seeing today with the financialization of modern economies, and it's not just happening in the U.S., you're seeing this everywhere at this point in time, is that financialization has literally destroyed economies wholesale. We've seen American manufacturing get gutted and shipped overseas, along with all the well-paying blue-collar jobs that it used to provide with society. You're seeing, serial asset bubbles being blown, along with commensurate economic and social destruction in the process. And then the companies that precipitate these events go crying to, Uncle Sam and say, we need a bailout, and they get their bailout. And they're being bailed out with our tax dollars, while at the same time they're exploiting your average tax-paying American. Okay? And the results of this, I think, really have been writ large at this point in time, and you see it really across the economic spectrum, for reasons that we've already discussed and that are obvious. But revolutions, oddly enough, historically, they start with the middle class. Those that are at the very bottom, they tend to accept their lot a little bit better than the group in the middle that used to do quite well and now don't. And if you look at the data on the middle class, and there's a lot of there's a lot of moving target there as to what exactly constitutes, somebody who's in the middle class. But the aggregate numbers have decreased from about 60% down to about 49% in the last 10 years. And it's really a shocking number, because when you think about it, the creation of the middle class is what allowed the post-war economic boom, and that made America the great beacon of democracy and a thriving economy in the post-World War II period. And now the corporations are systematically dismantling that mechanism, and literally killing the goose that laid the golden egg. Because if there aren't large numbers of Americans that work and make good money and pay taxes and can afford to buy their products, then who's going to buy them? I mean, even Henry Ford recognized this with the Model T, back in the early 1900s, when he dramatically increased the wages of his production workers.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. We've had such a evaporation of the middle class that that it's hard to even tell. I read in the Chronicle like a year and a half ago, the people who made $147,000 a year, a family with 2 children, were considered to be lower middle class, or of the one of us poors. And when we've got income disparity like that across the board, across the country, where you've got someone in the Midwest, where I grew up, where it's still fairly cheap to live unless you're in a giant city, looking at a family of 4 who's making $147,000, that is real wealth in the Midwest. Here in California, I mean, I have 3 kids. I can tell you from experience that making 150 grand a year is barely getting by. And you live in Santa Cruz County. It's absolutely ridiculous here. But I do believe I believe you're right that historically the revolution does come from the middle class. I think people are so trapped in their own comfortability, even if they're poor, they've got a computer, in their hand that they can watch movies on, or they've got a laptop that they can, stream from Jeff Bezos and watch whatever Amazon approved propaganda comes through that. My wife watches that show Bones. I don't know if you've ever seen it or not, the forensic anthropologist lady. But there was one of the characters is a conspiracy theorist, and went on this big long rant in the middle of an episode that she had on last night about how I've studied every conspiracy from every angle, and the way that the George Bush administration explained 9/11 is without a doubt the only way that could ever happen. Like, made sure to drive that into an episode. What we're subjected to through casual forms of media in terms of propaganda is something that I think would make the people who made the original propaganda films for World War II like very, very happy. I don't think they ever dreamed of having the reach the State Department or intelligence agencies do now. I want to spring something on you because I was reminded of it today. Did you know that Gloria Steinem worked for the CIA?
I don't.
Yeah. Apparently she used to brag about it in the 50s and 60s. And there was an article in the Chicago Tribune a few years ago where they quoted her as saying, oh, well, it was a completely different CIA back then. They were benevolent and peaceful. And this is while we're overthrowing several Latin American countries, where the Korean War, it just started, 63, I think, was when we went to Vietnam unofficially. And just remembering that she had a connection to them, like, made me want to kick myself enough for not being ready with that little nugget of information at the go. But it kind of explained a lot to me in terms of where, like, Santa Cruz white lady liberals are at. Oh, and my internet connection gets really messed up right when I start talking about Gloria Steinem being a CIA agent. That's hilarious. We nicknamed the NSA. You what?
Surely just a circumstance.
Right. We nicknamed the NSA agent tasked to monitor the show Kevin. So if you experience any internet problems, go ahead and blame Kevin. Um, it's fascinating to me because I wasn't born until 1978, so I have no reference point for the 60s. But the more that I study about it, the more that I read about it, it's fascinating to me that like every principal character out of that era worked for the CIA or did not went up against them and got murdered. I'm going to pause there for a minute and see how you feel about finding out that Gloria Steinem was a CIA agent.
Well, to be honest with you, Steve, I really don't spend a lot of time researching things outside of, the financial markets and the economy and things of that nature, just because it's not my focus. I mean, that wouldn't really enable me to do my job a lot more effectively or provide a better service to my investment advisory clients. So it's not something I spend a lot of time on, but there's a lot of interesting stories out there about various intelligence services being involved in this and that, and our country's track record with that sort of things, like everybody else. I mean, the British are of course certainly not innocent, and none of the old colonial powers from Europe are. There's been a lot of really nasty, dirty things done in the name of national security and intelligence, over the eons, and we're no different.
No, and even right now, there's a bill moving its way through Congress called the Earn It or Earn IT Act, which is basically going to kill end-to-end encryption for private citizens, and you would then have to prove to the government that you can be trusted not to be spied on by following a certain amount of rules or protocols, which honestly would makes my wife nervous because she's a bookkeeper. She handles people's money. She would like to be able to not have to worry about that in general. I would imagine that as a financial advisor, security in terms of what you have stored on computers is incredibly important to you. Do you I'm gonna kind of wrap it up here in a moment. I've only got a couple of more questions left. What is like basic financial advice that you don't have to charge for that you could give people right now, given the set of circumstances we're currently facing?
Well, first of all, I would say be very, very careful. The idea that this whole coronavirus thing is going to blow over and be no big deal in a short period of time, I believe that idea is wishful thinking at best. At a professional level, I pulled all of mine and my clients' money out of the market on February the 28th because I looked around and I didn't like what I was seeing and where this was going. I also had the benefit of being in this industry for 24 years. I had front row seats on the dot-com crisis, and of course I had front row seats on the great financial crisis of 07-09. So I would be mindful of that. Those of us that make decisive decisions from a financial and monetary perspective, and we do it quickly, are the ones that are going to have a much better chance of surviving this period. I think that come the summer, June, July, that kind of period, the results of this, the economic results of this, are going to be truly horrifying. I've seen estimates of gross domestic product or economic growth declining by double digits, 10 to as much as 25%.
Wow.
Although 25% I think is far too extreme and unlikely, but a 10 or 15% decline for a quarter wouldn't surprise me. I think you're going to see double-digit unemployment north of 10%, and you're going to see an absolute parade of corporate revenue and earnings reports that are going to miss substantially, and that is going to put a huge amount of downward pressure on stock prices that are already grossly overvalued and in a market that is highly leveraged with a lot of margin debt and things of that nature. So people are going to see a lot of downward pressure on their retirement accounts and their savings accounts, particularly if they're invested in financial markets. You're going to see a lot of defaults. You're going to see a lot of companies that levered up in the post great financial crisis period, where they borrowed every dime they could get their hot little hands on and used every dollar of free cash flow to buy back their shares and manipulate their earnings per share number. You're going to see a lot of those companies go under. There's a lot, let's say, I think it's 18 or 19% of the S&P 500 companies, the last time I checked, were essentially zombie companies where they were cash flow negative and in debt up to their eyeballs, and they were keeping themselves alive by borrowing money and playing financial accounting games. Those companies are very unlikely to make it out the other side of this. And so I would just say, be careful and be very conservative. And really, the sage advice of Warren Buffett, I think, here is very relevant. And what he said was that there's really only two rules to investing. Number one is don't lose money, and number two is don't forget about rule number one. And as that sounds, it's really an expression of basic mathematics, right? And it kind of goes like this: if you have $100,000 and you lose half of it, you now have $50,000, and in order to get back to break even, you now have to double your money. And I can tell you from 24 years of experience in this business, it's a hell of a lot easier to lose half of it than it is to double it.
Yeah. Well, Caleb, it has been a pleasure. I certainly enjoyed this. I learned things, and that's why I do the show in the first place. As I try to get people smarter than me on to explain things to me that I have questions about. So I appreciate that. Josh, if you could pull up Caleb's website real quick so they can get a look at it, and we can throw a link in the chat. And yeah, just one more time, Caleb, let everyone know where they can find you. And thank you again.
Oh, it's my pleasure to be on the show, Steve, this afternoon. It's been great. My website is www.clinvestments, that's with an S.com. If you do a Google search for Caleb Lawrence, you'll find me with these. On my website, I have the Market Bull blog, where I publish a video of the things that I write and talk about every day. This is an extension of the radio show that I retired from back in late 2018. I also upload that video to Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, and also YouTube as well. So I'm easy to find out there. A lot of great information, a lot of history on the blog, where you can go back and watch previously recorded shows that I've done, and trying to make it educational and fun and entertaining, as unfortunately with business and economics, it's a pretty dry subject, and at times, people's eyes, they just roll up in their head and they glaze over when you start discussing this stuff.
All right. Well, thank you again, Caleb. That's going to do it for the show at 6 p.m. Pacific, 9 p.m. Central. The Free Assange Vigil will be streaming here and on Action for Assange and on the platforms that we stream on through there. We're going to be speaking to Reality Winner's mother and daughter. That will be fascinating. And big thanks to Caleb again. Big thanks to Sleepy Josh on the ones and twos here. This has been Slow News Day. I'm Steve Poikinen, and good luck to us all.